When people look at an older man living alone, especially one in his 70s or 80s, they often jump to the easiest conclusions. They assume he must be lonely, that life must feel heavy, that solitude automatically means sadness. It's such a common picture that many families worry the moment an older man begins living by himself. But the truth behind this stage of life is far more nuanced, far more unexpected, and in many cases far more empowering than most people realize. Living alone in later years doesn't always signal decline. Sometimes it marks the beginning of a new chapter built on strength, clarity, and quiet personal freedom. I want to start with a man I met a few years ago, a man who completely shifted the way I saw aging and independence. His name was Harold, an 82-year-old who lived in a small, peaceful home tucked away on a quiet street. Nothing about his house looked extraordinary. Simple garden, shoes neatly placed near the door, a warm lamp glowing from his living room in the early evenings. But once you step inside, you could immediately sense something about him. The calmness, the order, the gentle rhythm of someone who had built his life with intention. When we first spoke, I asked how he managed everything on his own at his age. Most people expect an older man to struggle without help, to feel overwhelmed or defeated. But Harold just smiled with a kind of ease that only comes from a long life of lessons. He said that living alone wasn't the burden so many imagined. It was the first time he had learned how to listen to himself, how to understand what gave him peace, how to build his own pace without pressure or expectation. As he talked, I realized I had been carrying the same assumptions society holds. I expected fragility. Instead I found depth, clarity, and a grounded sense of self. From there, the conversations I had with him and with many other older men living alone revealed a completely different reality. The picture of the lonely senior lost in silence exists, of course, but it does not define most of them. In fact, what I discovered were truths that showed just how strong, adaptable, and emotionally rich older men can become when they navigate life independently. One of the first things that stood out was the emotional resilience these men quietly build. Living alone forces a different kind of relationship with themselves. They learn to sit with their thoughts instead of drowning them out with noise or distractions. They face memories they once avoided. They revisit old mistakes not with shame but with a willingness to understand. Over time, this private process creates a strength that isn't loud or obvious but deeply rooted. It's the strength of a man who has weathered storms, survived losses, and arrived at a stage of life where he is no longer running from anything inside him. Harold once mentioned that in his younger years he rarely had time to reflect. Life was busy, expectations were high, responsibilities stacked up quickly, and emotions were often pushed aside rather than processed. But living on his own forced him to slow down. It gave him the space to look inward instead of constantly outward. That space, he said, became the foundation for a kind of emotional clarity he had never experienced before. Many older men living alone share this same transformation. Others may think they're fragile, but in reality they have grown emotionally stronger than ever because solitude gave them a chance to understand themselves in a new way. As I continued meeting older men living alone, I noticed another recurring pattern, one that actually surprised me even more. Many of them take far better care of themselves when they're on their own than when they lived with others. It sounds counterintuitive, but once you hear their reasons, it makes perfect sense. Without someone else to depend on, they become responsible for their routines, their meals, their habits, and their environment. Instead of falling into complacency, many rise to the challenge. They start paying attention to what they eat because no one is reminding them. They simply understand that if they don't care for their health, no one else will. This sense of accountability often leads to healthier choices, not worse ones. Some older men begin cooking lighter, cleaner meals because they realize heavy foods make them feel sluggish. Others start walking every day just to keep their body moving. A few even pick up new skills, basic stretching, light workouts, simple home exercises, because staying active becomes part of their identity rather than a chore. Living alone becomes a wake-up call, a moment where everything they do has a direct impact on their well-being. Instead of relying on a partner to remind them, they build discipline from within, and that discipline becomes their strength. But this doesn't mean they don't carry emotional weight. Many older men living alone have experienced painful chapters, losing a spouse, going through separation, drifting apart from family members, or simply watching their social circle shrink as the years pass. These experiences leave marks, but the remarkable part is how they process them. Instead of burying their emotions or denying the past, many learn the quiet art of acceptance. By facing their thoughts honestly in their solitude, they develop a wisdom younger generations rarely understand. I've heard countless stories from older men who, after years of emotional turbulence, finally found peace not because life became easier, but because they became better at making sense of their struggles. In that sense, solitude becomes a teacher. These men are not running from anything. They've learned to sit with their feelings long enough to understand them, long enough to extract the lessons, long enough to find harmony with their own history. This emotional wisdom is something younger people can only learn with time, and many older men develop it not despite living alone, but because of it. There's also a misconception that living alone automatically means being socially isolated, but what I observed was often the opposite. Older men living solo may not have large social circles, but the connections they do maintain tend to be meaningful. They choose the people who bring joy rather than stress. They enjoy conversations with neighbors, participate in local groups, chat with familiar faces at the park or community center, or share moments with grandchildren whenever possible. Unlike younger adults who sometimes chase numbers, more friends, more events, more social validation, these men understand the value of quality over quantity. Harold once told me that he doesn't see people every day, but the interactions he does have mattered deeply to him. He greets the same neighbor every morning, has weekly coffee with a longtime friend, and shares stories with a small group at the library. These relationships provide genuine connection without overwhelming his peace. He isn't surrounded by people, but he feels grounded. He isn't constantly socializing, but he isn't lacking affection either. That distinction between being alone and being disconnected is one of the most misunderstood aspects of aging. People assume solitude equals loneliness, yet many older men living alone have a social life that is smaller but richer. They find comfort in consistency, in familiar faces, in conversations that feel real. Their days aren't filled with noise, but they are filled with meaning. This kind of connection often leads to deeper emotional satisfaction than a house bustling with people but lacking warmth. As I observed these patterns, another truth emerged, one that many older men rarely say out loud but feel strongly. Living alone becomes a chance to rediscover who they are. For decades, they may have played roles: provider, husband, father, caretaker, employee, problem solver. But when those roles naturally shift with age, a quiet space opens up for them to reconnect with their own identity. They begin exploring hobbies they set aside years ago. They dive into interests that once fascinated them but never fit into a busy life. They keep their home the way they like it, follow schedules that feel right to them, and choose how to spend the hours of each day. Harold turned to gardening in his backyard, not to impress anyone, not to fill time, but because watching something grow brought him peace. Other men have taken up woodworking, storytelling, reading, writing, or even learning technology. These aren't just hobbies, they are expressions of self. With no external pressure to meet expectations, older men finally have the freedom to live by their own rhythm. And psychologists have long said that having a sense of choice is one of the strongest predictors of happiness in later life. But perhaps the most surprising truth I discovered came from listening closely to how these men adapt mentally. Many people assume older adults lose flexibility in their mindset or become stuck in their ways, but the men I met were often incredibly mentally adaptable. Living alone pushed them to learn new skills, embrace new challenges, and stay curious. When there's no one else at home to take care of certain tasks, they quickly learn how to manage things themselves, managing bills, fixing small household issues, navigating new technologies, or trying out unfamiliar tools. The more they tackle these tasks, the more confident and capable they feel. Living alone encourages a kind of mental freshness. Instead of becoming stagnant, many rise to the challenge of self-sufficiency. They explore new ideas simply because they can. They read more, think more, observe more, and engage more with the world around them. This curiosity keeps their mind active and protects their sense of purpose. Over time, it becomes part of their identity. Far from being outdated or rigid, many older men living alone are constantly learning, adapting, and evolving. And woven through all of this is one final truth that carries a quiet but profound power. Independence gives many of these men a renewed sense of dignity. When they realize they can handle life on their own terms, their confidence grows naturally. Their sense of self-reliance becomes a source of pride. Even if they move more slowly, even if certain tasks require extra effort, the fact that they continue doing them strengthens their inner resolve. They don't view independence as a burden but as a validation of their capability. This dignity is subtle but unmistakable. It's in the way they organize their homes, the way they keep track of their routines, the way they manage each day with intention. It's not about proving anything to others. It's about proving to themselves that they are still strong, still capable, still in command of their life. And that inner strength radiates outward. As these truths settled in, I began to see that the lives of older men who live alone are far richer and far more dynamic than society often gives them credit for. We tend to view solitude through a narrow lens, assuming it reflects emptiness or vulnerability, but the reality is much more layered. Solitude can also be clarity, intentionality, and renewal. It can be the place where strength rebuilds and where emotional balance deepens. And for many older men, it becomes the environment where they finally feel free to live in alignment with who they truly are. What struck me most while listening to these men was how consistently they emphasized personal choice. They weren't living alone because they had given up. They were living alone because they had adapted. Whether life circumstances placed them there or they chose it consciously, the outcome was the same. They learned to shape their days with purpose. Instead of being swept into the expectations of others, they crafted routines that reflected their values. They found comfort in small rituals, morning coffee by the window, afternoon walks, evening reading, weekend visits from family. In these rhythms, they built lives that were quiet yet full of meaning. And this is where we reach the deeper message hidden behind everything these men shared. Happiness in older age is not determined by whether someone lives alone or with others. It depends on the habits they build, the mindset they carry, the relationships they nurture, and the emotional openness they allow themselves to embrace. Living alone does not automatically create loneliness any more than being surrounded by people guarantees connection. What matters is how a man fills the space within his life, not how many people fill the rooms around him. In fact, many older men living alone have created environments that nurture their well-being. They prioritize calmness over chaos, genuine conversations over noisy gatherings, and meaningful activities over mindless distractions. They choose connection without overwhelming themselves. They choose movement instead of stagnation. They choose curiosity instead of resignation. Over time, these choices accumulate, shaping a life that is not only survivable but deeply satisfying. Harold embodied this transformation beautifully. One late afternoon, as the sun filtered gently through the leaves outside his window, he reflected on what independence had taught him. He spoke about companionship with fondness. After all, relationships were a central part of his life for many decades. But he also spoke about the peace he found within himself, a peace that didn't depend on a partner's presence or approval. It took him many years to understand that inner stillness does not come from someone else. It grows inside, slowly, through acceptance, through understanding, through listening to one's own needs. That kind of wisdom doesn't arrive easily. It comes from living through joys and losses, from adjusting to the realities of aging, from learning to navigate solitude with grace rather than fear. When Harold told me that he felt more content at 82 than he had at 50 or 60, it was because life had finally slowed enough for him to see what truly mattered. He had stopped measuring his worth by what he could accomplish for others and began valuing the peace he cultivated for himself. Many older men I met expressed something similar. They were no longer trying to be everything for everyone. They were no longer tied to the roles that once defined them. Instead, they discovered a quieter identity, one rooted in resilience and calm. Living alone provided the space to rediscover themselves without pressure or expectation. And that rediscovery often brought a sense of pride, an acknowledgement that even in later years, growth is still possible, change is still achievable, and fulfillment is still within reach. This shift in perspective is something society often overlooks. We tend to celebrate the independence of young adults, but when older adults live independently, we express concern or pity. Yet independence, regardless of age, is a profound source of dignity. For older men, managing their daily lives, preparing meals, organizing their home, handling finances, caring for their health, becomes a powerful affirmation of their capability. It reminds them they still have agency, that their life is still their own to shape. Of course, this doesn't mean their journey is free from challenges. Physical limitations may arise, energy may fluctuate, memories may fade at times. But what stands out isn't the difficulty, it's the way they adapt. When they struggle with something, they find alternatives. When they need help, they learn to ask without shame. When setbacks occur, they find their balance again. This adaptability is not a sign of weakness. It's the continuation of a lifetime of perseverance. The more I spoke with these men, the more I understood that independence in older age isn't about doing everything perfectly. It's about maintaining a sense of identity, purpose, and autonomy. It's about having the confidence to navigate each day with intention. And it's about recognizing that solitude is not the enemy, disconnection is. Most older men living alone are far from disconnected. They simply value their space and use it to honor their own needs. Another powerful lesson I learned from these conversations is the importance of staying mentally engaged. Many older men living alone naturally develop strong curiosity. With fewer obligations pulling them in different directions, they begin exploring topics they never had time for before. Some dive into history or science. Others explore spirituality, philosophy, or creative arts. Many learn to use new technologies to stay connected with family or to entertain their minds. This mental engagement not only keeps their cognitive abilities sharp, it adds richness to their daily life. Harold's curiosity was one of the most infectious parts of his personality. He loved learning about different cultures, understanding how things worked, and discovering stories from around the world. He said that curiosity kept him young, even when his body reminded him of his age. And he believed that as long as he continued learning, he would never feel stagnant. This mindset is something many older men share without even realizing it. Their minds stay flexible because they continue feeding their interest in the world. And when you combine this intellectual curiosity with the emotional wisdom they develop over time, you get a powerful combination. These men become observers of life, able to appreciate the small details that once went unnoticed. They become thoughtful listeners, aware of the stories behind people's words. They become steady, patient individuals who understand the value of silence and reflection. In many ways, their solitude allows them to grow into the most grounded version of themselves. As I reflected on everything I learned, I realized that the story of older men living alone is not a story of decline. It's a story of transformation. It's a stage of life that can be filled with meaning, strength, and rediscovery. It's a chapter where independence becomes a source of pride, not a sentence of isolation. And it's a reminder to all of us that aging does not diminish a person's ability to adapt, evolve, or find joy. If there is a takeaway from all these conversations, it is this: living alone after 60, 70, or 80 does not define a man's happiness. What defines his happiness is the life he builds within that solitude. The routines he creates, the relationships he maintains, the mindset he chooses, the peace he allows himself to cultivate. Many older men thrive not despite living alone, but because solitude gave them a chance to grow in ways they never expected. And as Harold often reminded me, independence has a beauty of its own. Companionship is wonderful, relationships are meaningful, and human connection remains important at every age. But there is also something profoundly peaceful about knowing you can stand on your own, make your own choices, and live in harmony with your own thoughts. That peace is not given by another person. It is built slowly, intentionally, from within. As we close this reflection, I hope any senior watching this feels seen, understood, and respected. If you're a man living alone, know that your life holds value, purpose, and possibility. If you're a family member caring about an older man living on his own, remember that independence can be a source of strength, not weakness. And if you're simply curious about aging, let this be a reminder that the later years of life are not merely about enduring. Many times, they're about becoming. Everyone's journey is different, but the truths shared by these men reveal something universal. Aging is not an ending. It's a transition. It's a chance to rediscover yourself, to grow softer in the places that were once hardened, and stronger in the places that once felt fragile. Whether you live alone or with others, what matters most is how you embrace the life you have and the peace you choose to build within it. As you reflect on your own life or think of someone you love, remember these stories and these insights. They come from real men who have walked through decades of change and emerged with wisdom that deserves to be heard. And perhaps, in their journey, you might find guidance for your own.